What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Behind the Door with Jeremy Hiltz and Brandon Brown. We got a very special guest here today. In the last few episodes, we've been talking about a lot of specific information with recovery and reentry and the need for prison reform. But today we have a really special guest with us because we at Behind the Door, being Jeremy, myself, and the crew of people who helped us create this, recognize that you can't talk about incarceration without talking about a lot of specific things. And in one episode, we talked about acknowledging the racial disparities inside of our criminal legal system, and that's something that we'll pick up moving forward as well. But today, we have a great guest. My good friend Nicole's here to talk about gender-specific issues in reentry and recovery, and to really name out loud the difference for incarceration and reentry and recovery with men and with women, and really kind of unpack some of those specifics. So just want to say a big shout out to Nicole, and thank you for being here. And go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody and kind of tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are, and why do you think you're on Behind the Door today?
Well, I'm Nicole. I currently run a recovery residence for women. It's definitely something I'm passionate about. And I also work for a company called Youth-Led Justice, preventing the little kiddos from, being a statistic and, becoming incarcerated like we weren't once was. I think I just have a little bit of a dynamic. I know what it's like being female and behind the door.
So tell us a little bit more about that. I think you said something really interesting. You said so that the kiddos don't end up like us. And so tell the people listening today a little bit more about your story with incarceration and reentry.
So I didn't really get into trouble until I was a little bit older. Like I was kind of a late bloomer, I guess they would call it. I used to run a successful daycare center, and I just happened to get in a car accident one day and was prescribed opiate painkillers. So it kind of just got crazy from there. It was in a period of time where the doctors were just pumping them out like crazy, and I didn't realize that I would become addicted to them. I didn't realize that they were affecting me in any way until it was kind of too late. And so this is, going back to like 2014, 15, where the stigma was still real. Going to treatment, being a mother, and like signing up for treatment was like just horrible. I didn't want to own any part of me, like being dependent on anything, because I had a real community that supported me, and they never, I didn't want them to know that side of me. I didn't want them to ever see me struggle. And recovery wasn't a real thing back then. It seemed like there was drug addicts. That's what, people recall. There was either drug addicts and, they might have gotten clean, but we don't know. And that's just kind of the narrative I saw. So I was really afraid to even get help. I owned my own daycare center, and it was really successful. I took care of people's children. We had up to 30 children from the community. So I got in a car accident. And then, things kind of started to change. I was prescribed opiate painkillers. And that was at a time where they were really like giving them to everybody. So me not knowing my family history like I should, I became very dependent on them. I ended up selling my share of the daycare center, being a stay-at-home mom, and, things just kind of got worse from there. There's a lot of stigma that went with it. Back then, people weren't treated, really fairly with the whole, struggling with substances. You're a mom, you're not supposed to struggle. You're a mom, you're supposed to, only care about that. Like, how could this even happen? So a lot of my story I kept to myself. I had a really good support system that I hid a lot of stuff from because I was afraid. And that just kept getting worse. So after, my fiance at the time and I broke up, my resort was selling my prescription. And, you sell some and then you need to buy some. And it just was a never-ending battle in that type of world. Me obtaining a prescription from a doctor went from selling it, buying more, mingling with the wrong people that were in the same business that I was trying to get into, the sales of narcotics. So, it didn't just end right at prescriptions. Like, I got caught, did a couple months. County was horrible. They gave me a pretty lengthy probation period, which, I was a horrible probationer. Like, I pretty much ran the whole time, every time I was on probation, because county jail was so traumatizing to somebody that had never been around this type of thing. Like, the correction officers that worked there were crazy towards me. It was just real traumatic, let's just say that. But so yeah, so then, every time I got in trouble, well, really only one more time. Like, I had a couple probation violations for not checking in and using substances. And they never really offered me anything like treatment or anything. It was like, okay, girl, you ran for a long time. Like, we couldn't find you, so you're going away. So, like, I probably did another 6 months. And after that, like, I was able to, start doing a little bit for myself again. But, the cycle of substance use just kicked right back in. And I really went crazy then and just started selling, like, realizing that I could make actual cash doing it. So I started thinking I was like, Rico Suave, I don't even know, like, selling all kinds of drugs and hanging out with crazy people. And so I was on the run for 2.5 years, and I thought I was cool. I'm like, probation can't find me, like, but I was really just wasting my whole life. Like, I lost a lot of relationships because of that. And at the time I was in active use, I never realized, like, what that was doing to me. So, after the last time, like, some crazy serious charges came, aggravated trafficking, aggravated furnishing, and they were offering me 10 years. So it's like, what? I'm going away for 10 years. I'm going to be 40 by the time I'm out. Like, I really, like, to me, my whole life was over. I was like, this, like, contemplating suicide. Like, do I even want to live this life? What's my life going to be worth when I'm 40? So moving forward, like, I ended up copping out to, I got 10 years all but 4. So I was to serve 4 years with those 6 years hanging over my head, which, I still thought was a lot, but I was like, whatever. And I was honestly not even thinking about the future and how this would affect me in any way. So I got to DOC, and at first, like, I was a hot mess. Like, I was like, this is crazy. Like, I have, people were kind of like crazy towards me anyway. Like, I just didn't fit in. And then I started finding, like, a sense of community, and every opportunity, like, I don't care if it was like, hey, you guys want to go to the garden? I'm like, yeah, pick me, I'll go, just to get out of the building. So I started doing that. I was at the reentry center. I went to the horse farm. And I used to have horses, like, when I was younger. So that was just so meaningful. And I noticed that every person that put a little bit more hope and, like, trust into me, the more, like, I started to grow. I'm like, this person isn't seeing me like I'm a big piece of shit. They're seeing me like, hey, you can do this. Like, the horse farm, it was an equine rescue. Like, that was where it started. Like, people just loved me there. And I'm like, wow, maybe I'm not, like, a waste of space in society.
They treated you like a human being.
Yeah. They really did. And, like, some of them didn't even know. Like, one of my best friends, she didn't know, and she kept asking for my number, and I'm just like, oh, well, I don't have a phone. And then we were in the field one day, and I was like, I gotta tell you something. Like, I'm in prison. And she starts crying. I start crying, and she's like, like, you poor thing. Like, you talk about your gardens, and you're doing gardening over there, and I never even assumed that those sunflowers were yours. And I'd bring them bouquets, and they just never knew I was in prison because I was so ashamed of my story. And it's somebody that I still, stay in contact with now. And, like, the reentry center, like, gives you a lot of good opportunities, but you can also, like, there's a lot of gatekeepers. There's people that really can hold you back when you really, like, need these things to move forward. You need a job in reentry at the reentry center to have money when you get out. Like, if I wouldn't have had money, I would have been who knows what.
So you did the 4 years, and you transitioned from the the women's center, which is the regular, like, quote unquote maximum security prison for women. We only have one in our state. And then you went down to the Southern Maine Women's Reentry Center, and you had all these opportunities. And then eventually you were released home. So talk about just what was that transition like for you coming home, making that transition from being in an actual carceral setting to then coming home.
So, it was kind of scary. Like, everybody is so anxious to get out. And like everybody puts in for their supervised community confinement. Everybody puts their packet in and you're like, okay, it's only going to take X amount of days. Mine took probably like 9 weeks, which really wasn't long. And then once it was time for me to be released, like I was a little bit sad. Like I was the crazy one that was still like running around saying bye to people. And I'm like, this is a community that I built. I did my college internship there, holding space for women. I did all kinds of cool things there. So I'm like, what's it going to be like when I get out there? I knew I was moving to a sober living residence and it was co-ed. Like, how's that going to be? And once I got out, like, it was cool and all. Like, my first stop, I visited the horse farm that really, helped me grow again and flourish. So I visited them, and then my mom took me to the house that I was moving into, and I was like, I don't want to stay here. Like, send me back. But it ended up working out fine. Brandon came to pick me up, like, probably like it was like my second day out. Yeah. And we went to the dog park. I ended up reuniting with my childhood best friend, which is so weird because I don't own a dog. You didn't have a dog at the time, right?
Yeah, we brought the dog that was at the sober house.
Yeah, we brought a random dog from the sober house. Like, so it was like I didn't even have a dog, and I ran into like my childhood best friend. Like, crazy stuff. So I just started seeing these little glimmers of hope and like, you know what, girl, this ain't gonna be that bad. So what I did is I graduated college. I took a month off work. I was working at Dunkin's. They were really supportive of me. So I did buy a car. So I had to go back to work right away. Graduated college, walked my graduation with my peers, which was really meaningful. And then I just went back to work, waited it out, got a really cool job, and here I am.
I'm interested for you, Jeremy, because Nicole touches on something that's, I think, really important for us to recognize, which is, the difference between recovery and reentry and the stigmas that men and women face. And, for your program, you heard Nicole talk about the fact that, when she was struggling with her issues, that being a woman in recovery, being a mother in recovery, or being a mother struggling with addiction and substance use was this whole different set of stories and stigmas that, women were and continue to face in society. And from your perspective, running a program currently that serves a whole bunch of men in our state, is that something that you hear as a unique set of problems with them as, fathers or sons? Or do you think, hearing her talk about that's something that is unique to the experience of women who are struggling with addiction and recovery and reentry?
Yeah, first and foremost, Nicole is a complete badass. Oh. Honestly, man, I was like, just the way you just articulated like everything you've been through in such a way that's like, I was getting emotional when you were talking about like somebody having hope, you know what I'm saying, for you and believing in you. It's like, sometimes that's the biggest thing that can happen for anybody. You know what I mean? Man, woman, it don't matter, right? Like, right. But like that moment, and really like your sense of gratitude for these small things, it's beautiful to me. Like, it's like, that's what happened. Like, that's what happened to me. Like, you told, like, we obviously different stories in a lot of ways, but like that I connect with you on that, man. Like, that's like that. And, to just graduate college, like you said it, like it's nothing, you know what I'm saying? I'm going, wow, man, like, that's a lot of work, and it's a lot of like dedication, and to do it during a transition of coming out of incarceration, coming back into a world that you're like sort of unfamiliar with in a lot of ways, right? Like you had just gotten into it on the front of the prison, that lifestyle, and then you're coming out, and this is another world, yeah, separate from that, you know what I mean?
For sure.
And then to just be here with your fucking head up.
I mean, it's the confidence thing, and like when I can definitely sense like a difference from when I first came home. Like, and I'm not gonna lie, like it's hard because, for men, I feel like everybody wants to date a prisoner, somebody who just got out of prison. It's like these big studs, tattoos, and badass. But you tell somebody that I actually went on a date and told somebody that they're like, well, where you've been? I used to know them. And it got real weird when I was like, oh, I was incarcerated. Like, and then they ask if you had a girlfriend in there and all these crazy narratives. They think like everybody's shacking up, and it's not even like that. Like, yeah, sometimes maybe some people, but
I do want to address like the question that Brenda I think was really asking me is these differences that I've seen treatment and reentry in our work and the things and there is a different mindset when it comes to women's reentry than it comes to men's reentry, right? It just is, and I think it's some of that. It's really the resources aren't built in, don't become built in like they have been for women. It's not like specific women's programming, which is something that we are certainly a priority of ours to get into next. But like thinking about I used to do a group in the Southern Maine Women's Reentry Center down there. We used to do that quite often, and what I saw, this is from my perspective, this the trauma in the way women have deal with it in that setting, it looks different than the way men have dealt with it. You know what I mean? And women that are incarcerated deal with other issues. Human trafficking is a thing. You know what I mean? And what comes along with that, lots of times women are ended up in prison after being victimized in their lives. You know what I mean? And so when we were doing those groups, it was like there was no really where when a woman was in this position coming out like that was really a prevalent resource. It wasn't like it wasn't in the forefront of people's minds. You know what I mean? And then I've seen women coming out of reentry services that might have had like a super traumatic background, and they go into like co-ed recovery houses, and sometimes I've always thought, and this is no knock and disrespect if this is, you know what I mean, but
it's real
for me like just from a trauma standpoint, it's difficult, right? It's like a difficult scenario. I'm just like, my therapist mind is just looking at it going, man, like I couldn't imagine being a woman that's had a ton of trauma in her life, and then she comes downstairs and then is eating breakfast. I don't know. It's just a weird scenario to me.
It's important to really name like a few things in this conversation, right? And one of the things we have to name and that we really can't hide from is that the conversation around criminal legal reform, the conversation around prison reform has been dominated by the conversation around like the racial disparities in our criminal justice system, and for good reason, right? We know that the system has been built off of the back of oppression of minority populations and people of color in our country. But one thing that's happened as a result of the conversation being dominated by male-specific issues, because we have so many men in prison in our country, is that women do get lost in the conversation, right? And what a lot of people don't know, it's common knowledge how many people are in prison. It's common knowledge the racial disparities of incarceration in our country. But what's not common knowledge is that women are actually the fastest growing prison population in the United States of America. And so this is something that happens when a conversation is dominated by one segment of a problem. It makes the other segments of the problem invisible. And so what you are talking about and what Jeremy is talking about is that there's not enough gender responsive outlets for women getting out of prison because they haven't dominated the conversation in the recent past around criminal legal reform. And Jeremy and you both bring up really good points. We know that the majority of women who go into our system have deep backgrounds of trauma, right? Have backgrounds of domestic abuse, sexual abuse, human trafficking, all these really terrible things that, 99% of society is going to say we need to stop those things. But that 99% of society doesn't also say that we need to treat women with services and programs and dignity who have gone into the system as a result of that trauma. And you've identified like a major point of conversation that we have to have, which is that we do have to be conscious of what women go through when they're in prison. We do have to be conscious of the fact that women are being released with a completely different and in a lot of ways more damaging stigma after incarceration. And you named something, and I would love for you to kind of unpack it a little bit more, which is that when you come out of prison or when you're dealing with addiction and substance use and some of these struggles, that the narrative is, as a mother, you're just supposed to be strong and figure it out. And to me, that's a really ironic narrative, right? Because we have these gender narratives in our society that like men are supposed to be strong and tough and violent, and women are supposed to be gentle and loving. And so as soon as you take somebody and you expose them to trauma and abuse and all these things, and then we act surprised that, parts of the self, like that nurturer, is lost. And then we like categorically like oppress women coming out of prison because they don't fit into that narrative. It's very, very damaging. And you talked about it from your perspective. And what have you seen with the women that you've worked with and that you've helped, as they face that stigma of what it's like to be a woman in recovery and in reentry?
So what seems so interesting to me is that a lot of the, and just from my perspective, a lot of the men that get released, they're not typically like the everyday caregivers, right? So the moms that get released, they're expected to be these caregivers and to jump right back in. And that's fine to a certain extent, but they still need like the resources that they, need. You can't just throw them back in. But then when they don't jump right back in and, they're not quite ready to, they've been away for years. So they're not quite ready to, come home to mommy, like I have a house, I have this, I have that. Then people judge. They think, oh, well, they don't want to be with their children, or they're not doing good enough. They're living in a recovery residence, so they're not able to take care of their kids. Well, if there was more resources and more appropriate, like we can't even, as a felon, you can't even get housing really. Like I'm working with one person right now trying to get her housing. Her crime was 4 years ago, and it's like, how is a mother supposed to get housing when nobody will rent to them? You have that felony on your record, and it just seems like it's impossible. I know it's not, but it seems impossible. So like, where is the resources to, kind of give the mothers the support they need? I'm not saying that men don't struggle, but the women, the mothers, they just have a different set of needs.
Mm-hmm.
Just being in prison is traumatizing. Not everybody can come out resilient. Like a lot of people are like me, but there are some that are not, that come out and they just don't know what to do. And I'm thankful that I can help women that are reentering, and I don't have all the answers, but I think that just the stigma alone, we can do some work with that.
Well, go ahead. Well, you have given them some support, right? And you connect with them on that level. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
we were talking about the stigma of it. Like I just was imagining like you're a transition from being, from back to the beginning when you know what I mean. You got dependent on pain medication through a doctor, and then the shame of that, and then you put the shame of the next thing on top of it, and then the incarceration. And then how long did it take you to go from the accident to where you're sitting today?
I mean, to be honest, like I'm still not there.
But what, just in timeline,
like a timeline, probably a good 5 years.
So just let me
6 years probably.
6 years, okay. So
Yeah.
6 years. So 7 years ago, you own a daycare,
Yeah.
and like this isn't even on your radar, right?
Right.
Going to
Never.
prison isn't on your radar.
Never.
5 years later, you have these two labels on you right now, right? Substance use disorder, right? Or the addict, right?
Right.
And somebody that's reentering, right? And then, so there's two different things, and I'm wondering for you, like, what does that feel like? It must be like hard to navigate, I guess, and that's really kind of what I'm asking you is how do you deal with those two things, like to go, now I have these two particular labels on me.
And that's like such a good question, because it's something, that the people that support me continue to tell me, and Brandon will always say, like, know the power of your story. And the old me would just hide, and I would, and I would even judge other people trying to hide my own problems.
Yeah.
And, that's kind of part of it, but just knowing the power of your story and not really caring what people that have no significance in my life have to say.
And you also mentioned resiliency, right? So you're resilient in receiving the resources you found them for yourself, and you're able to navigate all that stuff. But you're somebody that has come from a professional background already. You owned your own business, so you had a leg up on probably most of the people that you were coming out of your fellow residents, right?
Right, for
but
sure.
you got a leg up, right? So you already know how to do things that for a lot of folks they haven't had the opportunity to do. How has that been, like, the barrier for that path? Your path has got to be a little easier because you have this leg up, right? So what are the barriers for these folks when they are sitting inside the reentry center going, what am I going to do next? And they don't necessarily have your skills or your background.
I mean, and some people have never taken care of a home. They've never learned how to live basic cleaning skills, basic daily living skills. And that's a real thing, and sometimes I think it's like a, it's a learned thing that they learn at the reentry center, and it's kind of a peer-led thing, but it's not always in the nicest way. Like, females can be mean, like,
there's a punitive approach to it.
Oh yeah, it's very whatever. So it's just, so coming out, like, some people don't know how to have normal relationships. They will cling to the first man that gives them attention or the first woman that gives them attention, and go all in. Some people don't know how to have normal, job skills. And that's why the reentry, like, allowing people to work and allowing, jobs that are gender neutral, not just jobs that are just for women, kitchen jobs, and that's one thing that I hope to, like, work on too, is, like, giving women equal job rights, like, give them jobs that a trade that they can learn.
It's amazing how empowering that is too. I just wanted to say, like I'm currently teaching a class at the Women's Center, and today was our first meeting, and a couple of the women, plus a couple of the women that have been part of groups that you and I have been a part of, learned how to weld while they were at the Women's Center or the Reentry Center, learned how to tile, learned how to do, like, these vocational trades that traditionally are, men's specific trades. And to hear the confidence in their voice when they talk about learning these skills, the automotive technology programs, and it really is such an important thing that we just don't name enough, is that when you equip people with skills that they're not even, like, supposed to have, right? Like, it really instills this sense of confidence in them. And I've heard that in you and your story, and knowing you for, the time that we've been friends, is like, there's been times where you questioned yourself, like, I don't know if I know this or if I'm good at this. And when we've talked about it, unpacked it, you've realized, like, oh, I can do that. And that sense of confidence, because you're defeating a narrative that's told about you, right? Like, as the helpless woman or the caretaker who can only do this and who can only do that. And then, like Jeremy was saying, add those layers of, like, harmful stories on top of it, and it becomes even harder to break out of it. But
that's why she is such a complete badass, honestly, right? Like, that, you think about this, what you just said, what she's been through in the last 5 years, and to come out of that trying to help people, you know what I mean? It's like, that's a warrior spirit, you know what I mean?
And staying, like, steadfast, dedicated, trying to help people. And I think that's one thing that the viewers and the listeners will never really understand from a short conversation with Nicole, is that, like, there is a strong dedication every day to asking, how can I help people not be in the situation that I was in, or not, have the same issues that I've had. And that's, like, once again, something that we don't talk about enough. Like, when we talk about criminal legal reform and we look at the faces for reform, it's only very recently that we have people talking about the need for gender-specific conversations. And the more people that do it, the more Nicoles that come out into the world and kind of, like, grab that social problem by the horns and just start, helping people find resources, the more normalized it will be in society to say, like, women's reentry is a specific issue that we have to address, and that women's substance use is it doesn't fit under the umbrella of just reentry and just substance abuse, right? There's not the same simplified problems that fit for men that fit for women, and we have to name those things and have that conversation. And I was thinking when you were talking, and one of the things that really blew my mind, I was sitting here thinking about, was, like, how ironic even the woman's narrative is in society, right? You said something that like a lot of people go into the system and they haven't had the leg up that Jeremy said that you've had, where you have owned your own business and you have done these things before you fell victim to over prescriptions and treating your pain with a really harmful drug that you ended up becoming dependent on. But like even women who didn't grow up in households and learn how to like be a caretaker and learn how to do all those things that we quote unquote believe women are just supposed to naturally know how to do, and yet we still fault them when they go through their issues and say and stigmatize them, say, oh, you're broken because you're not a good mother, you didn't prioritize your children, you didn't prioritize your family and your community. It's like a lot of women in society and a lot of women who are inside of our prisons never had the chance to learn that, right? They grew up in households where domestic violence and domestic abuse and sexual abuse were normalized. They literally never had a chance to learn those things, and then we fault them when they come home or when they finally get into treatment as if it's their fault. And I don't think it's something that's talked about enough.
No. And think about the generational trauma that is passed down from family to family, and even my own family. Like my mom, for instance, her upbringing might have impacted how she raised us. And, and that those systems just, they're just, people can't help that. And I've heard so many women tell me that they use drugs with their families. And to me, I was like blown away. Like, how could this happen? But it's really something that happens more than we think. So how can we blame somebody who was raised and given the first type of substance when they were 12 years old? We just can't. We hold them to such a high standard and then are unwilling to give them a chance once they're released.
Well, when you were talking about, the big badasses coming out of prison and stuff, right? With that funny, right?
Yeah.
But that guy is he's less vulnerable than a woman coming out because he's big, right? And he's tough and he's angry, right?
And people are afraid of
women
him.
are putting are literally just looked at differently. It's about sex. It's about like what they look like. So the issues are night and day. You know what I mean? For me, I never got out of prison and had to like worry about the same things. You know what I mean? I was just, because at the end of the day, my mind said, I'll just take what I need. You know what I mean?
Right.
So at some point, right before the last time, and so like I was able to have that mentality because I'm a man, right?
It's wild, man. It's wild to think about what you're saying, like to really like key in on this piece. Like when men get out of prison, they're feared, right? And like you and Nicole both said, like, a guy gets out and the expectation is he's going to be big and muscular and tattooed and have like this not give a shit attitude. And like women go through the same system, and that's not what we expect from any woman coming home. It's actually the opposite, right? And this is like I don't even know that we'll make sense of it.
What's a societal narrative?
Yeah, because women.
So she's already wrong because she's not at home with the children.
Right.
Well, she's in prison, right?
And it's crazy to think that a woman goes into a harmful, punitive system and comes out and is expected to be like. I can't even say expected. There's not an expectation. That's the problem. We just continue to demonize them for the things that happened that led them to prison. Where a man comes home and you might, fear him, but also like feel this like odd, strange attraction to him, right? Like the only thing I can equate it to is like zoo animals almost, right? And that's how I felt when I first came home, for real. Like, and like to talk about what you were talking about.
Zoo animal.
No, but it's like, people like want to hear your story. Like they're fascinated by it. They want to hear you and see you and like observe you. And how did you do it? All these really ridiculous questions. And it's like, we normalize even that question.
Right.
Like, did you drop the soap? We joke about. We joke about and normalize male on male institutionalized sexual violence, right? And we actually don't talk about the damaging realities of what those jokes are. But then think about the opposite for women. Have you ever been asked if you dropped the soap in prison?
I mean, probably actually.
But like, okay, so scratch that question. But the point
What
is,
about the roommate thing? Everybody asks, like, "Oh, you and your roommate, huh?"
but is it like, is that stereotype and that stigma about like forced sexual abuse, which again, ironic because a lot of women end up in the system after suffering that type of sexual violence. But it's like we feminize incarceration almost. Like you don't hear about the gangbanger hyper violence that exists in a women's prison. You hear about like those, oh, it must be so intimate, and you had girlfriends, and you had like all these ridiculous stories. We completely, the Orange is the New Black stories, but we completely fail to recognize that you got released from an incredibly violent system. You got released from a system where the rates of sexual assault, staff to resident, they're through the freaking roof. We know that in prisons across the United States of America, male staff are sexually assaulting female prisoners. We know that that's true, and yet this is something that we don't talk about when women come home because, again, we only focus in on the narrative of failure, right? And it's weird that for men, we almost glorify prison in some ways. We still stigmatize it. I don't ever want anybody to think that as a man coming home from prison is easy. Like, no, you have to deal with the weight of stigma and the weight of stereotype and all that.
Set of issues.
It is a completely different set of stories that you fall victim to. And I'm like interested in this conversation about how ignoring those stories of women going through a violent system completely throws a blanket over the experience of women before they enter that system. And it completely hides the fact that so many women go into prison and get into substances as a result of the trauma and the abuse that they've endured. And then they can't even name it when they come out because of all of the Orange is the New Black stories that exist that almost make it acceptable that, you know, oh, you probably entered into a queer relationship while you're in prison because a woman's supposed to be loving and supposed to be delicate. And so that's what you must have endured in prison. Like, it's not a big deal.
Or because it was their like weird creep fantasy, you know, that happens a lot.
Yeah, that's what people fantasize about, you know, how much more normalized, you know, female homosexuality is than male homosexuality, right? And so those stories exist in different spectrums of like how we tell them. But it's just wild, honestly, to sit here, the three of us, and unpack how differently these stories are affecting women and affecting men, and how we completely don't talk about it with women, the damaging results of prison, and how we force them to hide from the stories of what they went through before, during, and after, because we just expect you to be resilient and figure it out because that's what a woman's supposed to do. And yeah, I think I have an important question for you in your experience as somebody who's gone through the system, but now as somebody who's helping women come back through the system. What do you see as like some of the biggest puzzle pieces that are missing? And obviously this conversation will be really specific to the state of Maine, you know, but you're connected with people all through the country. And what do you think, where are we really missing the mark on addressing women's specific issues in substance, you know, use, recovery, and reentry?
So I think exactly what you said, you know, people are missing the trauma that's gone that from the beginning to during incarceration. And then when they're released, it's like that trauma is still there. Yes, the DOC might have many classes that they can take, but really a lot of people, they don't open up in those classes. There isn't a lot of one-on-one counseling. There isn't a lot of small groups. You got 20 women who will go and run every single story you tell. They will tell everybody in that entire reentry center. So there's no confidential space to get it out. So then people are re-entering society and they still have all of this stuff. They're still hanging on to it. And then when something comes up, they might do good for a couple weeks. And I'm talking about the ones that are not successful that end up, you know, either going back or I've had several people that I was in with pass away from substance use. So like these people they're still struggling when they get out. They're still struggling. They're still searching for whatever will make them feel better. You know, and I don't have the answer on how to make it better. You know, if I was to guess, I would say, let's not lock up every single person because of drug charges. So many women in the reentry center have drug trafficking charges because they were holding somebody else's drugs. They were selling drugs for somebody else to support their habit. Were they getting any of the money from it? No. Were they benefiting in any way other than staying unsick? No. So it's like, how can we start at the beginning, and before putting them in incarceration, how can we get treatment instead of, just, okay, here's a 10-year bid. Do you want to take 4 years and have 6 hanging over your head for the next 10 years? Or would you rather just, do 10 years? Like, easy pick,
Because that comes back to this like vacuum that we have with women's treatment services across the state of Maine, because it's like that is the logical thing to do, right? Like get somebody treatment. But, even with men's residential treatment, sometimes we got guys in the county for 4 or 5 months waiting for a bed to open up because we don't have enough beds, right? We don't have enough of that.
Right.
Those like longer term, like let's try to figure out long term, like what your life is gonna look like instead of going to prison, right? Like,
Right.
Because I know you had mentioned that you run a recovery house. You know what I mean? Sometimes that's not enough for somebody. Sometimes coming out of jail, that's not necessarily okay. Here's a roof over your head. Here's this. Because when I was in active use, I've had many roofs over my head and fucked it up. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Because I was, you know what I mean? It just, because I didn't have the skills necessary to stay a life. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I just think it always comes back to this, like how do we deliver the treatment to people? I think before they end up in the system.
Right.
So now we're in a dilemma where like, so what is it? You sit in prison, and then sometimes you get small charges, and you sit in jail so long waiting, and then you're almost done your time anyway. So you get back out, and you go back to doing the same thing because you didn't receive any treatment at all. You know what I mean? So there's got to be ways to develop the resources, and the only way I see it is that we have to start talking about it more and getting more people to go, okay, how can I add more beds for women coming out of prison? You know what I'm saying? And make it, and make the resources like life skills, that common sense stuff, right? Like to me, if a large majority of women, because what you're talking about here, when somebody is holding somebody else's drugs and doing all this, they're being trafficked, and they might not even know they're being trafficked, whether it's for sex or holding the drugs or whatever it is, right? I'm being trafficked in some way.
Because they're just doing what they need to do to get the mat.
And they're being used a lot of the time.
And so like you go to, and they're probably not doing a whole lot of time, a couple of years, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know what I mean? And then you're back out on the streets with really no skills.
Right.
So you're absolutely right about the treatment, but the issue is like, how do you raise enough noise to make it a priority in people's lives? You know what I'm saying? Like, our legislature, our community, and keep talking about it, because you really are. You have a gift in this thing, I think, and I hope you continue to use your voice every time you can, because what you just described to us you did it so well.
Well, thanks. And that's the thing. I think a lot of it's funding, a lot of it's, like some of our communities around here in our very neighborhoods don't support recovery residences. They don't want any of the money coming from their town budget. It's something I just dealt with. And I understand that from a business point of view, but at the same time, I can, and I had said to somebody, I said, I could name 10 people right now off the top of my head from this community that is unwilling to support this type of residence.
So I just want to clarify, I'm a businessman too, right? And so for me, people that get well and start working and paying taxes
offer more to our community.
Are
exactly,
as a businessman, right? That's the only thing that makes sense, is that we need more people paying taxes and doing the right thing, right?
And less crime.
Yeah. So like, even from a business perspective, it doesn't make any sense why we want people recovering in our community.
We also have to point out like a really deep irony about those type of people that you're talking about. And this has been a pretty significant wake up call for me. And I know you expressed this a little bit as well, Nicole, is like, until I got arrested, until I got sentenced to 27, all but 17 years, until I re-entered society, until I faced all the obstacles that I face as a person with a violent crime on my criminal record, I didn't care, right? Even when I was selling drugs, even when I was living a quote unquote criminal lifestyle, I still, didn't necessarily empathize for people that were getting arrested and being part of the system, unless it was like my homies, right? And I was like, man, my man got fucked over. It's not fair. Like,
Gross.
yeah. So, and it's like what you're talking about and what Jeremy's talking about, the community response to issues around addiction and incarceration. Like, people are going to feel that way until somebody they know and somebody they love gets caught up in the system. And Jeremy made, I think, like the most important point that we try to make with this podcast every single episode, every day when we talk about it, with everything we do, is we have to talk about these things. Because until somebody hears your story of being a daycare owner and being somebody who watched after 30 children, which means you contributed to 30 families in our community, and that's just on any given day. We go through years, and we're talking about hundreds of communities that you were service to, hundreds of people in your community, until they hear your story of, I didn't choose to become addicted to drugs. I didn't choose to be on the run from probation. We can really boil these things down to events that were beyond your control in your life and really start to humanize the story of people who experience these things. And for me, I think about two really important points that I feel like we've made today that I hope people walk away with. And like, one of them is that we have to talk about these issues. We have to name them. We have to like have really genuine, authentic conversations and stop blaming people for things that they didn't choose in their life, right? And when we're talking about women's specific issues, one thing that Jeremy and I are always talking about is you can't treat trauma with more trauma, right? Prison is traumatic. Prison is somewhere you go and you are exposed to trauma. You have no choice. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, and there's no ways around it. And so when we take women from our communities who have been traumatized, who have been exposed to different levels of abuse and violence, and then we put them in a system that normalizes violence and that treats you as less than human, we can never expect, no matter how good the programs are, for women to heal in that environment. We can't expect anybody to heal in that environment. But when we're talking about women-specific issues, what women come home to is such a different set of issues than men because of the stories and the stigmas that they face. And we can talk about giving, all of these services. And like Jeremy said, we can give a roof over a woman's head, but that doesn't mean that we've addressed her trauma. And we can create all these mechanisms and we can create all of these therapeutic opportunities, which we have to. That's something we have to do in society. But we also have to go back to the source of the problem, right? Which we have to really normalize conversations in our communities and in our legal system about what it means to be like criminally responsible, right? You shouldn't go to prison if you were a woman who has experienced a lifetime of domestic violence and sexual abuse because you were doing whatever you felt you needed to do to have your needs met, even if those needs revolved around substance use, because you didn't choose that life. And so we can't continue to believe that we can throw women, once again, our fastest growing incarceration group of people. It's our fastest growing group of people we incarcerate as women, specifically women of color, right? We can't continue to believe that we can throw them into a system that just continues to traumatize them and somehow they'll learn to do better. That's ridiculous. That's like, it makes no sense to believe that we can just demonize people for things that were out of their control and then hold that against them for the rest of their lives. It's ridiculous. How many women have you seen come home that like experienced trauma when they were younger, experienced trauma when they were in prison, and then run back to the same things that feel comfortable to them, which is trauma?
Right. And that's the thing. And like what we all, like the community, the state, even at a national level, need to recognize is that the prison is running out of room for women. Okay. So how are we releasing women on home confinement? We're releasing people on probation, but we're still running out of room. Mm-hmm. For the first time in many years, there's not a lot of room for long-termers, which is 10 years or more. The reentry is packed full. So that's just making everything worse. So it's like there has to be something, and we can't solve all the issues in one day, but
yeah, this is a good
start.
This is a huge societal problem, and just to take like even a different vantage point on it, like I think we in the United States specifically just need to start talking about gender better, right? Because if you look at another aspect of the system that we didn't have time to get into today, even women who are victims of sexual assault are demonized in our criminal legal process, right? So what's the first thing we do when a man is on trial for a sexual assault is we ask, what was the woman wearing?
Exactly.
We ask, how was the woman acting? You know, what type of makeup did she have on? What type of clothing did she have on? What's her promiscuous past, right? Is she a whore? These are like the type of questions we ask. Like, does she have slutty behavior? So we demonize women when they're victims of abuse. Then we demonize women when we say that they've been perpetrators of abuse, whether that's, trafficking drugs or literally any type of criminal behavior that we've labeled in society. So like the problem really, when we boil it down to, the bare bones of it, is we just have to start talking about gender better.
Right.
In America in general, like even aside from the conversation around criminal legal reform, we need to stop forcing women to play the role that 100, 200 years ago they played in society, because we know that that was a broken, dysfunctional society anyway, where we kept women oppressed and subjugated. We didn't give them all their rights. And then that history has led to the moment we're at now, where now we criminalize behaviors that don't make sense to criminalize, and then we criminalize behaviors that have led women to be victimized, as if a man, we teach men to say, this is who I can assault, this is what I can do. No, like you treat people how you want to be treated, right? And that should go even in our criminal legal system. If your sister, if your daughter, if your mother found themselves inside of the criminal legal system, what would you want the result to be? And that should be the answer that we think about in society collectively to address specifically women's issues of crime and punishment.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And we all know somebody that, is incarcerated. Like, even if you say that you don't have a family or a friend, like everybody knows somebody that is affected directly or indirectly by substance use disorder. So like, let's just stop pretending that we don't exist. Let's stop hiding from it, because it's out there. We're in the community. We're doing better. People are staying sober with this type of support. So like, why not? Talk about it.
And
do something.
What would your advice be, Nicole, to women who are coming home, who are kind of feeling the way that you felt at first and feeling the way that we're talking about, like super ashamed of, their past and what led them to be in prison and the fact that they're in prison? If we're saying that the key to making changes is to actually like be visible and be heard and talk about it, what's something that you could tell women who are really afraid to talk about it for all the reasons that you were afraid to talk about it? What's the advice that you would give them to actually stand up and be heard?
I mean, that's a hard one, but I think just do what you believe in, really. And, don't let anybody tell you that you can't do something. Don't let your past define you. I know that's so cliche, but, like, you just got to have your head held high. Like, I don't care. When I lived in probably the worst part of Lewiston when I first got out, and I walked down the street like I was the shit. I'm like, okay, period. Like, I just came home. Hang out with good people. Don't let other people drag you down because you're doing good. Hang out with people that support you, that love you, that, don't judge you. And then from there, once you get that confidence kind of built up a little bit, you can move on from that. You can start sharing your story with future employers that might understand, and they might meet you, and then you can change their mind and their heart. And that's all a start. My work, my new my daytime job, other than the recovery residents, they seem to love me because of my story. Like, they really care about what I say. They care about my input. They care about my experience and how I can better their organization and help other people with my experience. So just find something you're passionate about, and really I don't share my story with everybody, and I think you have to be sensitive sometimes, but do I care if someone judges me for being incarcerated? Really, probably not. It's just part of me now.
Yeah, you're getting there. I asked you the same question too, Jeremy, like with your therapist hat on, with, your extensive experience in recovery and running programs, and also, knowing that ARCOM is really consciously starting to expand into assisting women and offering those services too. What would you tell to somebody who came for treatment out of, everything that we talked about coming out of the system? What would you tell them as your best advice to just, be bold enough to own your story and tell your story?
We don't necessarily give advice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what I would say to somebody is, we see you. You know what I'm saying? We see you, and we don't care about all this other stuff. We don't care about you better prison, this, that. Like, we're gonna give you a shot. You know what I mean? Like, we're gonna give you the same opportunity as everybody else, and we're gonna do the best we can for you, and hopefully that like gains some trust, right? Because like I was at our man's residential program this morning. We were talking about belief systems, right? Like, what do we believe about ourselves is really going to be how we move forward in our lives. And when we can start connecting to those people that believe in us, like Nicole like really touched on in the equine therapy, and then we start collecting these people, right? We start collecting their connections.
Mm-hmm.
And then before you know it, we start feeling better. But we just need people to see us though first. You know what I mean? Like, I needed somebody to see me, and like that would be it for me. Is like, we see you. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, I think for me, when I think about this question, I think about, especially with women, but really with anybody coming out of, a prison setting, or, coming out of just a lifetime of being traumatized and interacting with systems. My advice would be similar to both of yours, but it's exactly the advice that I've given you, right, Nicole, since we've been friends. And it's like, don't ever underestimate the power of your story.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to hide from the abuse that you've endured when you didn't have the power to like really confront it. And that's something that a lot of people have to do, is find that power to confront what's theirs and what's not theirs. Like, I am not the person who's hurt me in my life. But one piece of advice that I give, really especially to people coming out of the system, but really to anybody who's ever endured, any type of pain and trauma in their life, is don't ever hide from the success story that you are. Even if you don't necessarily believe it completely today, I always tell people when they're coming out of prison and I connect with them, you survived something that most people, I can't tell you how many people in society have told me I wouldn't last 10 minutes. You did 13 years, I wouldn't last 10 minutes. And I tell people, you don't know what you're capable of until you have no choice but to be capable of it. And so my advice, to women like Nicole, who are coming home, who are finding their strength, who are finding their power, is don't offer your story to everybody, because not everybody deserves to hear it. But also, don't hide from the power of your story. You endured something that most people cannot imagine. And the moment that you recognize that you're a survivor because you did survive that, and that you're a survivor because you've survived everything that led up to that, is the moment that you start to reclaim your story for yourself. And I think that's what we just have to continue to do with Behind the Doors, push forward and you never hide from the story. Yes, we've made mistakes in our life. Yes, we've been victims of things that were beyond our control in life. But what we're doing is we're telling our stories and forcing people to confront, holy shit, these people are strong and they have value and they have insight and intelligence, because, Nicole, you're a melting pot of all those things. You have a wealth of all those things. And so, I hope that anybody who's listened to your story today, and I hope that anybody who's listened to stories past on Behind the Door, and to everybody who's going to listen to our stories going forward, really understands, if you want to know about real strength and real power, ask somebody who's been to prison how they did it. And the moment that we start normalizing those conversations is the moment that maybe we start putting people who have lived it into positions to prevent it, like what you're doing with the kids right now in our community. So
I just want to say real quick that this conversation has been my favorite one so far. No disrespect to Joe Jackson, but like, this has been really. Thank you for giving us the opportunity
Thanks for having
to hear you, and like, it's like, so proud of you.
Yeah, no doubt. And just for everybody, we're going to have Nicole back at some point, because we're going to be bringing more women on to talk about these gender specific issues. We're going to be really intentional on how we get a diverse group of people up on Behind the Door, talking about issues that matter, because we understand that there might be one master narrative around incarceration, reentry, and recovery, but we really need to get into the specifics. And so thank you, Nicole, for being the first woman to come on Behind the Door and really shine a light on these issues that matter so much that we don't talk about enough. And we can't wait to have you back with some of the other women that you're connected with to continue to talk about these things and force people to confront issues that really matter. So thank you so much for coming on with us today.
Cool.
Thanks.